Today we're going to talk about the most impactful Magic the Gathering set that you've probably never heard of. In fact, it's a set that doesn't technically even exist, and that set is Spectral Chaos. Do you need some paper Magic cards? You can get them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. The story of Spectral Chaos starts way back in the early 1990s. Richard Garfield was playtesting his new game Magic the Gathering with the help of students from the University of Pennsylvania. One of these early playtesters was named Barry Reich. Lore has it that Barry was actually involved in the first ever game of Magic, which he played against Richard Garfield himself and actually ended up winning. As playtesters were working on Alpha, Barry started working on his own set, Spectral Chaos, which was to be the first ever multicolor theme set. Barry actually started designing Spectral Chaos before Alpha was even released. One thing that makes Spectral Chaos unique is that Barry Reich designed the entire set by himself. While he did have help playtesting the cards, of course, unlike other Magic sets, which involve multiple designers making cards and tweaking cards, every single card in Spectral Chaos was designed by Barry Reich. Over the next few years, Magic sets were released, starting with Alpha in 1993, and it quickly became clear that the game was going to be a hit. Spectral Chaos finished the design process and went through 4 rounds of playtesting. In 1995, Barry submitted it to Wizards, but they decided not to print it. He tried again in 1997, but again, Wizards denied printing the set, and after it was rejected for the second time, it became clear that Wizards would never print Spectral Chaos. But the story of the set doesn't end there. Fast forward to 2020, 25 years after Barry Reich first tried to get Wizards to print his set, and nearly 30 years after he started designing Spectral Chaos alongside Alpha, a group of fans decided that the story of Spectral Chaos needed to be told. Keith Adams, probably better known as the Misprint Guy, bought all of the original playtest cards and set design paperwork for Spectral Chaos directly from Barry Reich, and a Magic fan going by the name of RagingRiverMTG started this Spectral Chaos Project, which used Barry's notes and the playtest cards to complete the Spectral Chaos set, updating them with modern wording and adding art and stuff like that. You can see the entire Spectral Chaos set over on chaosorb.com, but once all of the cards became public, it became clear that even though Spectral Chaos was never actually released, it is one of the most impactful sets in the entire history of Magic the Gathering. First off, even though Spectral Chaos was never printed, many of Barry Reich's designs and mechanics found their way into other sets printed during the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, including some very iconic cards and mechanics that still see heavy play to this day. Perhaps the most lasting impact of Spectral Chaos was its creation of the domain mechanic, which cares about how many different basic land types a player has. Barry created the mechanic for Spectral Chaos, and when Wizards ended up using it for the first time in Invasion, Mark Rosewater initially wanted to create a new basic land type to support the mechanic, which he called Barry's Land, as an homage to the mechanics creator Barry Reich. While Barry's Land didn't actually make it into Invasion, eventually it made it into Magic 2 decades later when the Waste basic land type entered the game, and Domain itself continues to show up in sets to this day, most recently just a couple of months ago in Dominaria United. As far as individual cards, Commander All-Star Living Death, printed originally in Tempest, that was actually a card from Spectral Chaos, an Orzhov sorcery called Afterlife, or the iconic Medallion cycle from Tempest, those 2-mana artifacts that reduce the cost of spells of a specific color. Those were actually originally from Spectral Chaos as well. The same is true of Darksteel's Lucky Charm cycle, like Dragon's Claw, which gained you life whenever a spell of a specific color was cast. Legacy staple and broken fast mana combo piece Lotus Petal, which ended up being getting printed in Tempest, is another Spectral Chaos design, which Barry had named Scroll of Parchment. Secondly, many more recent Magic designs actually call back to Barry's work in Spectral Chaos, and some of the most wild and far out mechanics that have been added to the game in the last few years actually come from Spectral Chaos itself. For example, Ravnica's Copy Enchantment was originally a Spectral Chaos card. World Purge looks a lot like Spectral Chaos's Temporal Loop. Recent Commander Precon card, Hurl Through Hell, is basically an instant speed and less color intensive version of Brainwash. Dubious Challenge, kinda just a twist on unruly summons. Recently, One Way Wizards has tried to increase the playability of equipment is making equipment that attach to creatures when they enter the battlefield, but actually Barry Reich did this first in Spectral Chaos with a Cauldra-esque cycle of equipment called Paxton Sword, Shield, Wing Boots, Helm, and Armor, which entered the battlefield and equipped to a creature, and this was a decade before equipment were even a card type in Magic, and 3 decades before self-equipping equipment would become a thing. Even more recently, Wizards added the excess damage mechanic to the game, where something happens if you deal more damage than necessary to kill a creature, but this mechanic was actually a part of Magic for nearly 30 years with Spectral Chaos's efficiency. Some argue that Spectral Chaos's Dawn of the Dead, which returns creatures from the graveyard as 2/2 zombies, was inspiration for the Embalm mechanic from Amonkhet, which did the same thing except the creatures were 4/4s, and in the last few years we've had multiple mechanics that mesh together 2 different creatures, like Mutate on Ikoria, or more recently Meld, which returned in the Brothers War. But once again, Spectral Chaos actually did this first with a card called Fusion, which literally just melded 2 creatures that were controlled by the same player together into one creature. You know that South Park episode where the Simpsons already did everything first?
Uh-oh, Simpsons did it! Simpsons did it! No! Simpsons did it! Simpsons did it! Ah! Don't have a cow, man!
Looking through Spectral Chaos, it kind of feels the same way. For so many current cards and mechanics, Barry did it first in Spectral Chaos. Artifact lands, Barry did it first with Orcish Canal. Death Shadow, you could say that Barry made the first one with Life's Leech. Half mana symbols from Unhinged, Barry's Undiscovered Country did it first. Spectral Chaos is even credited for creating the first mythic rarity way back in the early 90s with cards that Barry called very rare, which were either stronger than other rares or had just big, massive, flashy, flavorful effects like Staff of Odin. It wasn't until 2008, 15 years later, that Shards of Alara added very rare cards, now called mythic rares, to the game. As you can see, for a set that was never actually printed, Spectral Chaos has had an immense impact on Magic designs and mechanics over the past 30 years, and continues to do so to this day. As impactful and inventive as Spectral Chaos is, there are some designs which I'm glad haven't actually seen print. Some of them just look weird color-wise in 2022, like Psychic Storm is a Simic card that makes everyone sack half their permanents. In 2022, this card would probably be black, or maybe Rakdos, or maybe Mardu. There's also some absurdly broken fast mana cards, like the Anti-Mana Cycle, which are 0 mana instants that add a mana for each tap land of a basic land type you control. Or what about Life Geyser? Well, giving each player 100 life is definitely deserving of the exclamation point in the card stacks. Could you imagine how long it would take to finish a game of Commander once this card showed up, let alone if someone managed to copy it a few times with Thousand Year Storm or something? This said, there is one Spectral Chaos card that has never been printed and I would absolutely love to play in a game of Commander, and that card is Spectral Chaos itself. The double Wooburg 10 mana sorcery lets you switch places with an opponent. This might sound like a weird Mindslaver effect, but there's a big twist. Once you switch places with your opponent, if you win the game with your opponent's cards, your opponent actually wins the game. So once you switch places, your goal changes. Rather than trying to win the game with your opponent's deck and cards, you're actually trying to lose the game as quickly as possible, while your opponent who switched into your seat is also trying to do the same with your deck and cards. Before you ask, you can't just concede. That's the one rule of the card. If you concede, your opponent actually wins the game. Could you imagine how interesting this would be in a game of Commander, especially if it made everyone at the table switch seats and then tried to make them lose rather than win? Sure, it might get old after a while, but I'm kind of surprised that this card hasn't at least shown up in an unset. It seems like it would lead to some hilariously unique games. And that's the story of Spectral Chaos, one of the sets that has had the biggest impact on Magic over the past 30 years, but a set that doesn't technically even exist. Anyway, that's all for today. One last reminder, if you want to check out the full Spectral Chaos set, you should head over to thechaosorb.com. So what do you think? Did you know about Spectral Chaos? Are there any other designs from the Forgotten set that you'd like to see show up in the game eventually? Let me know in the comments. Looking for more Magic content? Well, check out our video about the 30 most impactful cards in the game's history, or the one about the 10 biggest cheaters the game has ever seen.